I knew something was wrong before I even got out of my truck. After 30 years of ranching, you develop a feel for things, kind of like a sixth sense that settles in your gut before your brain catches up. The moment I turned onto the gravel road leading to my property, something felt off. The air was dry, hotter than usual, and the cattle gathered near the north pasture weren't spread out grazing the way they normally were. They were clustered together around empty troughs, waiting. That's when my stomach tightened. I had just gotten back from a week-long cattle auction nearly 300 miles away. It was one of those trips I'd taken dozens of times before. Nothing unusual. Before leaving, I checked every fence, every gate, every pump, and especially my water system. Out here in western Oklahoma, water isn't something you take for granted. It isn't a convenience. It isn't a utility bill. It's survival. My ranch sits on 62 acres of rough country that my father bought back in the 70s. The land isn't pretty in the postcard sense. It's dusty, stubborn, and unforgiving. But it's home. Years ago, after saving for what felt like forever, I paid to drill a private well and install a 15,000-gallon storage tank. That tank was my insurance policy against droughts, equipment failures, and bad luck. Before I left, it had been completely full. As I drove toward it that afternoon, I expected to hear the usual hum of water flowing through the distribution lines. Instead, there was silence. I climbed out of the truck, walked toward the tank, and glanced at the gauge. Empty. Completely empty. Not low. Not half full. Bone dry. For a few seconds, I just stood there staring. My first thought was a leak. Maybe a pipe had burst underground while I was gone. Maybe one of the pumps failed. Maybe something happened during the heat wave. None of those possibilities made me feel any better, but at least they made sense. Theft wasn't even on my list. Who steals water from a ranch? Then I noticed something that shouldn't have been there. Fresh dirt. A long strip of it. It cut across the edge of my property like a scar. I followed it with my eyes. The trench started near my tank and disappeared toward the neighboring subdivision called Meadow Ridge Estates. Now, Meadow Ridge wasn't exactly my favorite place. It had been built about 8 years earlier when a developer from Dallas decided people wanted luxury homes in the middle of ranch country. Apparently, enough people agreed with him. The neighborhood filled up with retirees, remote workers, and folks who wanted the country lifestyle without actually liking anything about the country. They loved the sunsets, hated the cows, loved the views, hated the tractors. Over the years, we'd had our share of disagreements, but nothing serious. At least that's what I thought. Curious and increasingly irritated, I followed the trench. About 200 yards later, I found the source of my problem. There, sticking out of the ground like some kind of monument to bad decisions, was a brand new white PVC pipeline. It connected directly to my water line. I just stood there blinking. Then I followed it farther. The pipe crossed the property line and disappeared into Meadow Ridge. By the time I reached the subdivision fence, I could hear water sprinklers clicking in the distance. Green lawns stretched across the neighborhood. Flower beds looked freshly watered. Decorative shrubs lined every sidewalk. While my cattle stood around empty troughs, somebody was using my water to keep their hydrangeas happy. I wish I could tell you I exploded right then and there. Truth is, I got very quiet. My father used to say that anger is expensive and the smartest man in the room is usually the one talking the least. So I took a breath and headed back toward my mailbox. That's where things somehow got even worse. Sitting inside was an envelope with the Meadow Ridge Homeowners Association logo stamped on the front. I opened it right there beside the road. The letter was signed by HOA President Denise Whitaker. I still remember every word because reading it felt like getting slapped. According to Denise, the HOA board had authorized a temporary connection to my water system to preserve community landscaping during drought conditions. Temporary. Authorized. Preserve landscaping. Those words almost made me laugh. Not because they were funny, but because of how unbelievably entitled they sounded. The letter went on to explain that maintaining property values benefited the entire area and that my cooperation was appreciated. Appreciated. They never asked, never called, never knocked on my door. They simply decided my water belonged to them. Standing there with that letter in my hand, I suddenly remembered a conversation from years earlier. Back when Meadow Ridge was first built, another HOA president had approached me with a request. They wanted access to a small emergency line connected to my well. Just for fire protection, they said. If a wildfire ever threatened the neighborhood, emergency crews could access water quickly. It seemed reasonable at the time. We shook hands. I agreed. No contracts. No lawyers. Just neighbors helping neighbors. Apparently somewhere along the way, that emergency agreement had transformed into something very different inside the minds of the HOA board. And as I stared at my empty water tank under the blazing Oklahoma sun, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. Somebody had made a decision. Somebody had approved excavation equipment, contractors, piping, and installation. Somebody believed they had the right to take what wasn't theirs. What I didn't know yet was that the person behind it all was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. And before the week was over, the entire neighborhood would be at war with its own HOA. The next morning, I was up before sunrise. Sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and that HOA letter spread out in front of me. The more I read it, the angrier I got. Not because they had stolen the water, but because of how casually they had done it. There wasn't a single sentence that sounded apologetic. No acknowledgement that they had crossed a property line. No mention of asking permission. The entire thing read like they were informing me of a decision that had already been made. That attitude bothered me more than the theft itself. Around 7 o'clock, I called an old friend named Roy Henderson who worked with the Regional Water Authority. Roy had spent most of his life dealing with water rights disputes, and if anyone knew exactly where I stood legally, it was him. After hearing the situation, he started laughing so hard I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "Tell me you're kidding," he finally said. "No, they actually dug into your private line?" "Sure did." There was a pause. "Ethan, they just handed you the winning lottery ticket." By mid-morning, Roy had checked every record available. My well was private. My storage system was private. The emergency fire agreement from years ago had never granted permanent access, ownership rights, or unrestricted usage. Legally speaking, Meadow Ridge had about as much claim to my water as they did to my truck parked in the driveway. That was all I needed to hear. I drove out to the tank, shut off the main valve feeding their unauthorized pipeline, secured it with a heavy-duty lock, and installed fresh no trespassing signs around the property. Then I went about my day. The first phone call arrived before lunch. Then another. Then another. By 3 o'clock, my phone looked like it was having a seizure. The HOA secretary called. A landscaping contractor called. Somebody claiming to represent the HOA attorney called. One resident left me a voicemail explaining that her rose garden was suffering severe stress and demanding immediate restoration of water service. Another complained that brown grass would lower home values. I listened to each message and deleted them without responding. Finally, around 4, I answered one. "Mr. Harper," a woman asked sharply. "This is Melissa from the Meadow Ridge HOA office." "Okay. We've noticed a disruption in community irrigation services." I nearly laughed. Disruption in community irrigation services. What a fancy way to describe stealing water. "Have you?" I asked. "The board would like the connection restored immediately." "I'd be happy to consider that." She sounded relieved. "Wonderful. Just send me the signed contract authorizing your access to my private water supply." Silence. "Excuse me. The contract." More silence. Then she cleared her throat. "I don't believe we have one." "Then I don't believe we have a problem to discuss." I hung up. The next day was when things got interesting. Around noon, a black luxury SUV rolled into my driveway. Out stepped Denise Whitaker herself. Denise was one of those people who somehow looked annoyed even when she was smiling. Perfect hair, designer sunglasses, expensive clothes that didn't belong anywhere near a ranch. She walked toward my porch carrying a clipboard like it was a badge of authority. I met her outside. "Mr. Harper," she said, "we need to talk." "Seems like we do." She didn't waste time. "You cannot simply cut off access to essential water services." I looked around theatrically. "Essential. Our residents depend on it." "For drinking?" I asked. "For landscaping maintenance." I nodded slowly. "So flowers." Her jaw tightened. "Property values matter. So do property lines." That landed exactly the way I hoped. Denise crossed her arms. The board acted in the best interests of the community. Funny thing about that, I replied. I don't live in your community. The conversation went downhill fast after that. She accused me of being unreasonable. I accused her of theft. She threatened lawsuits. I invited her to file one. At one point, she actually said, "The neighborhood has certain expectations." I remember smiling and saying, "So do I." One of them is not having people dig trenches across my ranch while I'm out of town. For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across her face. She had expected intimidation to work. It probably worked often inside HOA meetings. It just wasn't working here. Eventually she left, but not before promising legal consequences. As her SUV disappeared down the road, I realized something important. Denise still believed she had leverage. That meant she hadn't fully understood the situation yet. So I decided to help her understand. That afternoon, I documented everything. Every trench, every connection point, every section of pipeline. I used my drone to capture aerial footage showing exactly how the unauthorized line crossed from my property into Meadow Ridge. Then I contacted the county sheriff's office and filed reports for trespassing, property damage, and theft of resources. The deputy who arrived wasn't exactly shocked. Rural counties have a long memory, and stories travel fast. Once he saw the footage, he shook his head. They really thought this was a good idea? Apparently. That's bold. That's one word for it. The deputy chuckled. I can think of a few others. Word started spreading almost immediately. Small towns are funny that way. You can spend thousands on advertising and nobody notices. But let one HOA steal water from a rancher, and suddenly everybody becomes a reporter. By the following morning, people at the feed store were talking about it. Folks at the diner were talking about it. Even the cashier at the hardware store asked me if the rumors were true. Then local media got involved. One television station requested copies of the drone footage. I sent it over. That evening, footage of the pipeline appeared during the 6 o'clock news. The story exploded. And that's when Meadow Ridge began turning on itself. Residents who had no idea where the irrigation water came from suddenly learned the truth. Some were embarrassed. Others were furious. A few felt outright betrayed. Several homeowners actually stopped me in public over the next couple of days. One elderly couple approached me outside a farm supply store. The husband removed his hat and said, "Sir, if what they're saying on television is true, I want you to know we had nothing to do with that." His wife nodded. We thought the HOA had arranged some kind of legal agreement. They weren't the only ones. Similar conversations happened again and again. The deeper the story spread through the neighborhood, the uglier things became for Denise and the board. Homeowners began demanding records. Questions started flying. Who approved the project? How much money was spent? Why wasn't the community informed? Why were contractors hired without a vote? Why was private property involved? The answers weren't making anyone happy. Meanwhile, nature was doing its part. Without access to my water, the neighborhood's lush appearance started fading fast. Oklahoma heat doesn't care about HOA bylaws. Lawns turned patchy. Flower beds wilted. Expensive landscaping began showing signs of stress. Every day the subdivision looked a little worse. Every day, residents became a little angrier. And every day, Denise found herself under more pressure. By Friday afternoon, barely 5 days after I returned from the auction, I received an email requesting a formal meeting. Not a demand, not a threat, a request. That alone told me how dramatically things had changed. The meeting took place in the Meadow Ridge clubhouse. When I arrived, the atmosphere felt less like a neighborhood discussion and more like a hostage negotiation. Several board members looked exhausted. Denise looked like she hadn't slept in days. The attorney sitting beside her spent most of the meeting staring at paperwork. For the first time since this whole mess began, nobody was talking about lawsuits. Instead, they were talking about solutions. Denise cleared her throat and slid a document across the table. The board is prepared to remove the pipeline immediately and issue a formal public apology. I looked down at the paper, then back up at her. That's generous. She didn't smile. We would like to resolve this matter. The room fell silent. Every eye watched me. The truth was, a week earlier, an apology might have satisfied me. But things had changed. They had already shown exactly how badly they needed access to that water. They had spent years building a neighborhood designed around resources they didn't own. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't sitting across from people negotiating from a position of strength. I was sitting across from people who had run out of options. So instead of signing their apology agreement, I reached into my folder and pulled out a completely different document. When I slid it across the table toward Denise, her expression immediately changed. She picked it up, scanned the first page, and her eyes widened. Because what she was reading wasn't a settlement. It was a business proposal. For a few seconds, nobody said a word. The only sound in that clubhouse was the hum of the air conditioner fighting a losing battle against the Oklahoma heat outside. Denise kept reading. The attorney beside her leaned closer. One board member adjusted his glasses and quietly muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." I wasn't. The proposal was simple. If Meadow Ridge wanted access to water, they could have it. Legally, transparently, under terms that protected my property and compensated me for every gallon they used. $5,000 per month. Strict usage limit. Mandatory metering equipment at their expense. Quarterly inspections. Automatic termination for missed payments or unauthorized expansion. No exceptions. No handshake deals. No assumptions. Everything in writing. Denise finally looked up. "You're charging us?" I leaned back in my chair. "No, I'm offering you a choice." Her face tightened. "This is outrageous." That made me smile. Funny. That's exactly what I thought when I found a trench running across my ranch. A couple of homeowners sitting along the wall actually laughed. Denise didn't. Neither did the attorney. He was busy reading through the contract with the expression of a man who already knew how this conversation would end. After nearly 20 minutes of debate, arguments, and attempted negotiations, the reality became impossible to avoid. Their alternatives were terrible. They could remove the pipeline and spend a fortune redesigning the neighborhood's irrigation system. They could drill their own well, assuming they could even secure permits and survive the costs. Or they could accept the agreement sitting in front of them. The attorney finally closed the folder and looked directly at Denise. Legally speaking, this is probably the most favorable outcome available. The room went quiet again. Denise stared at him as if she hoped he'd suddenly change his mind. He didn't. Eventually she picked up a pen. I still remember that moment. The woman who had marched onto my property days earlier demanding access to my water now sat at a conference table signing a contract to pay for it. One signature, then another. Just like that, the entire situation changed. The unauthorized pipeline was replaced with a legal connection. Professional meters were installed. Monthly payments began arriving exactly as scheduled. And to their credit, after the agreement was signed, most of the residents became surprisingly easy to work with. A lot of them weren't bad people. They had simply trusted the wrong leadership. Over the following months, I got to know some of them better. We'd run into each other at local events, county fairs, and farm supply stores. More than once, homeowners apologized for what happened, even though many of them had never known about the theft in the first place. As for the money, I didn't waste it. The first year's payments helped fund major upgrades around the ranch. New fencing, better pumps, additional storage capacity. Improvements I'd been putting off for years suddenly became possible. In a strange way, the HOA's attempt to take advantage of me ended up helping my ranch become stronger than ever. Denise, on the other hand, didn't fare quite as well. Within a year, she was voted out as HOA president. From what I heard, residents never fully forgave how the entire situation had been handled. The secrecy bothered them. The arrogance bothered them. But more than anything, they hated becoming the laughingstock of the county. And believe me, people talked about it for a long time. Even today, years later, somebody will occasionally bring it up over coffee and ask, "Remember when Meadow Ridge tried stealing a rancher's water?" Everybody laughs. Then somebody else tells the story again. The funny thing is, when I first discovered that empty tank, I thought the water was the real issue. Looking back now, it wasn't. Water was just the symptom. The real problem was entitlement. Somewhere along the line, A group of people convinced themselves that wanting something badly enough entitled them to take it. They stopped seeing boundaries. They stopped respecting ownership. They stopped asking permission because they assumed permission wasn't necessary. That's a dangerous way to think, whether you're talking about water, land, or anything else in life. Every now and then, I still drive past Meadow Ridge on my own trail. The lawns are green. The flowers look healthy. Sprinklers click away in the evening sunlight. The neighborhood is beautiful, I'll give them that. And every month, right on schedule, another payment arrives. Sometimes I catch myself smiling when I see those perfectly maintained landscapes. Not because I enjoy their expense, but because every blade of grass reminds me of a lesson that some people learn the hard way. If you want something that belongs to someone else, ask. Because the cost of asking is usually a lot cheaper than the cost of assuming. And honestly, that's the part of this story people argue about whenever I tell it. Some folks think I should have accepted the apology and moved on. Others think I should have sued them for everything I could get. Personally, I think accountability matters more than revenge. But that's just me. So now I'm curious what you think. If you came home and discovered your neighbors had secretly been using your property for their own benefit, would you have accepted an apology, taken them to court, or done exactly what I did and turned their mistake into a business deal? Let me know down in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about entitled people finally facing consequences, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around because trust me, this wasn't the last time somebody underestimated a rancher.